Hey guys, welcome to week 11. We're getting really close to the end of this unit. I have decided to move your due date for A3 from November 20th to November 22nd, which just means that instead of turning it in on Friday, you'll be turning it in on Sunday. And I did this because I really want you guys to have the weekend to make revisions based on whatever peer review comments your partners give you. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of extra time for that. But today we are going to be talking about logical fallacies, just sort of reviewing on what we touched on last week. And then we'll talk about how you can appeal to your stakeholders' ethos. So your credibility as a writer, essentially. And then we'll talk about counter arguments, how you can include those, and we'll go over a few different organizational patterns that make sense based on what your topic is and who your audience is. So you get to choose between those when you're working on your A3s. This is just a little review from last week. Your thesis should be debatable, meaning someone should be able to disagree with your thesis or claim, and there should be an ongoing conversation about this already. There should also, your argument structure should be based off of that thesis with reasons and evidence that will support your claim. And these should logically support your claim to where your reader says, oh, that makes sense. And they should also emotionally appeal to your stakeholder audience and their values, needs, and beliefs about this issue. So just a general overview of the argument structure. You have your thesis here at the top. This is what's going to be essentially the map for your entire research argument. And then you provide your reasons, which obviously you can have more than two reasons, but I was just using two for the sake of clarity here. And then you have your evidence to support that, and evidence can include all kinds of different things which are listed here. So we also talked about logical fallacies and how it's really important that you avoid these in your argument. They manipulate your reader's emotions and misrepresent someone's character, or they could distort an argument's logic, which breaks the connection between your thesis, reasons, and evidence. And this could be intentional or unintentional, but regardless, they weaken your argument. So it's really important to look out for those and make sure that you're not making any of these mistakes. So a few logical fallacies, or at least the most common ones listed here, have an ad hominem attack. So you're really attacking the person's character and not the argument itself. So an example of that would be, anyone who gets an abortion is evil. You should really talk about, if you're going to argue that, you shouldn't attack the person, but maybe like the act itself and why, why people shouldn't do it. And then we have an ad populum, which uses popular support and not logical reasons and evidence. So saying everybody does it, so you should do it too, basically. Then there's a slippery slope, which says making a series of unwarranted steps, often leading to the worst case scenario. So, if they start to censor literature, the next thing you know, they're going to be burning books. And circular reason is when you're using a version of the thesis to support the argument that you're making rather than actual evidence. Hasty generalization is coming to a conclusion with little to no evidence. Post hoc ergo hoc is one thing that causes another, assuming that one thing causes another simply because it came after the first thing. So if I brushed my teeth this morning and then I won the lottery, I must have won the lottery because I brushed my teeth. And then there's faulty analogy or comparison, which is comparing two things that really have nothing to do with each other and not explaining that comparison. And then there's either or reasoning, which is breaking the issue into oversimplified choices. So, either you work out or you die would be an example of that. So now let's talk about how you can appeal to your audience's ethos. So, as we remember, the ethos is essentially your credibility as a writer. How do you show your audience that they can trust what you're saying? And really, when you don't have like a PhD or some kind of degree, you do this by including sources that support your points. And even if you were someone that had a PhD, you would still need to include evidence for your claims. So your argument has to be evidence-based. What that means is any claims you make must be supported by evidence. So you should not just rely on one or two sources throughout your entire paper, because this is going to make it look like you haven't done a ton of research on the issue, or like there's not a lot of support for your position. If you only include little bits of evidence, then your reader's going to think, wow, they must have only found evidence that supports this in like these two places. So make sure to diversify your sources and include at least two pieces of evidence for each reason, but I would recommend more. And each piece of evidence should come from a different source, ideally. So we want to continue to use credible sources that follow the 3 R's that you guys analyzed for your annotations. So these are relevancy, recency, and reliability. You want to make sure that you're using academic sources when possible. This is going to help your audience, think, oh, this person is someone that I can trust because the sources that they're using are reliable. And then when it comes to your academic and popular sources, here's this checklist that I've been showing you throughout this whole unit. I'm not going to go over it again because I just feel like a broken record repeating all this stuff, but if you want to take a look at it, there it is for you. But let's go back to appealing to ethos. So you want to make sure that you're using your source's credibility to improve your own. So that means you can decide on using either narrative or parenthetical citations. Usually you'll use a combination of both. And if you have a source that is written by someone who's well respected in the field or well known, make sure that you share that with your reader because it'll only make your argument look stronger. So here's an example of what this would look like. Students today study 15 hours less than they did in the 1990s. And then they have the author's names and the page number here in parentheses. So this is the parenthetical citation, and it puts the emphasis on the information only. So this person decided that it's not as important that their stakeholder knew who it was coming from, but rather they wanted to focus on that information. Now, here's a different example where they make sure to tell us who the authors are, and this is a narrative citation, which is putting the emphasis on both the source and the information. So both are really important for the audience to know. Only using narrative citations can make it difficult for a reader, though, so make sure to consider that and not, do this every single time, because it's a lot more work to read this sentence than it is to read this sentence. Oftentimes, when people are reading, they'll sort of overlook this unless the certain information you provided is something that they want to look into further, but for the most part, they'll just read the sentence. So don't give your reader more work than they need to do if it's not totally necessary. Though you do want to make sure that you're using narrative citations the first time you introduce a source, and that's really important. Discussing alternate point of views and counter arguments. So this is a requirement for A3. You have to make sure that you are addressing the counter argument. So what's a counter argument? So this is any argument that is in a disagreement with your claim or reasons. So it explains why your claim is wrong, either all of it or part of it, and it uses evidence and reasoning to undermine your claim. So why should you include this in your research argument? Well, it shows your willingness to consider the issue from all sides, and it reduces your reader's tendency to say, yes, but have you thought of this? So it's going to answer their opposition before the reader can actually do it themselves. So how should you include a counterargument? Well, first you want to anticipate, based on your research into the issue, what the counterarguments for this issue are. And then you want to summarize it fairly. So you want to make sure that you're including sources that show that you've carefully considered and researched these other ideas, that you are not being biased. And once you mention it and include that research that supports it, then what? Well, you can refute it or you can concede to it. So let's talk about those a little more. If you're going to refute an opposing view, then that means you're questioning the opposing view's reasons and supporting evidence, or whatever assumptions they've made. And this identifies flaws or problems in the logic, or it disproves statistics. So here's an example. A student claim is that universities should limit spending on rec centers because it reduces the funding for other necessary educational spending. Well, the counter-argument to this would be that officials may argue that they have to spend massive amounts of money in order to compete and stay ahead of other universities, and rec centers are one way to do that. So if you were refuting this counter-argument, you would say something like this. Although universities are right to care about being competitive, research shows that students may not necessarily care about all of the extra bells and whistles of rec centers, and they're just happy to have the free services. So notice that, this is coming from a reliable source. The student has included it there, so they're supporting the claims, and they're completely refuting this counter-argument to show why their claim is the valid one. So if you can't refute the counter-argument, you can't find a problem with that view or the evidence, and the other side is providing a solid argument, then you're going to concede to that opposing viewpoint. So you need to acknowledge that, this shows that this is a complex issue, and there are two sides to every issue. So concede to that. Say admittedly, or I must admit that, or I agree with, blah, blah, blah. These are a few different ways that you can do that here. And then shift the focus to where your position is strong. So let's look at an example here. The student claim is that legalizing recreational marijuana can provide strong economic benefits to the states that do so. The counter-argument is that legalization will probably increase the number of addicts and can affect youth and adolescents disproportionately. So let's say this is a valid claim and you have to concede to it. This is how this student does this. He says, "This is unfortunately true, but the benefits freeing up thousands of police officers from the war on drugs, reducing the black market, increasing tax revenue far outweigh the drawbacks." So what the student is doing is they're shifting the value field, not the issue. They're saying, yes, this is true, but here's all the reasons that we should still do this because it has the benefits outweigh the cons, essentially. So I want you guys to practice refuting counter arguments, and you're going to do this on your own. But we've talked about how the CSU administration should consider canceling class more often when it snows. Now, you won't be doing this as a group, but think about counter arguments that CSU administration would have, where they would tell you why they shouldn't cancel class after reading your argument about why they should. And then decide, based on those counter arguments, whether you would refute, so like oppose it and fight back, or concede and say, yes, this is true, but here's why it's still more important to cancel class. And be prepared to write these down, go over them, and think about how they apply to your own work. So, final word on counter arguments. You don't have to address every single counter argument to your claim, but you have to address at least one. Make a list of possible counter arguments that your stakeholder audience has, or has heard of, and then decide whether to refute or concede or ignore those. And choose the best one ideally so that you can fully develop that. And if you're addressing more than one, make sure that you address them separately and you use appropriate transitional language. And then decide where you will put it